Hello, welcome everyone on behalf of Board of Directors. I welcome you to the Gallery of Ukrainian Art Foundation. My name is Juliana Hlinchak. I'm the head of the programming committee. And right now we have this beautiful solo exhibit of the Ukrainian artist Bogdan Holovatsky, who is here with us today. So welcome, Pan Holovatsky. And congratulations on the wonderful exhibit. I think later on you can talk to Bogdan Holovatsky, but right now I would like to welcome in the gallery, and I am in charge of literary events, so I would like to welcome, and it's a big honor to have here Marsha Forchuk Skrypuch, a Canadian author for youth and children. And Marsha has published 25 books, and half of them on the Ukrainian topics. And we are very happy to have you here today with us, Marsha. So welcome. And Marsha's work, Marsha will be today introducing her newly published book, Winterkill. And this book and Marsha's work will be introduced by a young and talented, and I call her bookworm, Sonia Bodnar. Sonia Bodnar is a Toronto-based book blogger and a fourth-year student of International Relations and Regional Studies Bachelor Program. So you know, she's a newcomer from Ukraine, and she studies this online. She studies in Ukraine. While here, she not only studies in Ukraine, she also finished graduated from George Brown College with Human Resources Diploma with honors in 2022, and she's working in recruitment ever since. Reading was always her biggest passion, and she has owned book blog on Instagram where she posts her book reviews and recommendations. Her favorite genres are romance, thrillers, and non-fiction about psychology and neuroscience. Sonia is also passionate about social and environmental activism. She participated in Ecological Youth Forum, Poland, Katowice, Poland, dedicated to UN Climate Changes Conference, and held a speech about ecological initiatives in her school. Later, she deepened her knowledge on the topic of ecology and environmental activism in International Summer Camp for Youth, Experience and Develop Sustainability. Sonia also volunteered for Caritas Ukraine, working with orphaned and underprivileged youth, and organized a charity movie night to raise funds for Christmas presents for orphaned kids living in Caritas shelters. And lately, Sonia joined Kontakt Next Generation Ukrainian Youth TV show, where she talks about news in the world of literature and interviews famous authors. Her debut interview with Marsha in full length can be viewed on the Ukrainian Canadian Art Foundation YouTube channel. You can follow Sonia's book blog on Instagram, millionstories.bookclub. And one little detail which is not written here in the biography, as Sonia told me, and I think it's really explains her love to literature and books. She told me when she was a child, the way of punishment, if she did something wrong, was her parents would tell her, "You're not going to get the book. You're not buying your book." Okay, so welcome, Sonia, and we are very happy to have you here with us.
Welcome everybody. I'm very happy to see all of you here today, and I'm happy to welcome Marsha Skrypuch today at our event. She is a very interesting personality, so I'm sure you will enjoy this chance to talk to her and ask her questions. Marsha is the author of more than 20 books for young people, yet she didn't read until age 9. She now considers dyslexia to be her gift. She got her master's degree in library science and worked as a librarian for a short time, but then turned her hand to writing. She wrote her first novel and got 100 rejections for it. She set that book aside and wrote Silver Threads. Expecting to be rejected again, she sent it to a bunch of publishers at once, and within 2 weeks, 3 publishers approached her. That book was published in 1996, and since 1996, Marsha has had a book out pretty much every year. Her books seem to follow a general theme. They're nearly all about young people plunged in the midst of war and oppression. Her latest book is Winterkill, and that's the book I'm going to talk about today. It's a difficult book, but a very important one to read, and I'm fascinated by Marsha for doing this hard work. It's a tragic story, and usually people write about tragic events when these events happened in their life, and they want to share their pain, get it off their chest, and tell the world their story. However, for Marsha, is a completely different situation. I know that Marsha's Ukrainian grandfather moved to Canada before the World War I, and her family wasn't directly affected by hardships like war or famine. So it's not a personal story for Marsha, but still she decided to plunge into this darkness of tragic events in Ukrainian history. Research all the horrors of famine, process it, and write it into a book for young people. I know it wasn't easy for me to read, so I'm sure it wasn't easy for Marsha to process this pain and write this book, but it's such an important work. There are lots of resources about Holodomor in Ukrainian, but it's more difficult to keep the society aware and informed about it outside of Ukraine. In my opinion, this book is geared towards two important groups of people. Young Ukrainians who were born and raised outside of Ukraine, who want to keep their heritage and historical memory, and young people who are not Ukrainian. So they probably don't know much about Holodomor. And this book helps them get awareness of Ukrainian culture and tragic events that happened in Ukraine. Marsha is considered to be a children's author, but for me, this book didn't feel like a specifically children's book. I think this is a book for all ages that is also written to be understandable for kids, because the main characters of the book are kids, and we see all the events through their perspective. The main character of Winterkill is 12-year-old Nil from Felivka, a village near Kharkiv, Ukraine. Nil lives in a usual farmer family with his parents, 11-year-old sister Yulia, 9-year-old brother Slavko. His life starts falling apart when Stalin becomes the dictator of all republics in the Soviet Union and starts implementing his 5-year plan. The first bad omen was when a Canadian communist comrade White and his daughter Alice arrived to their village. They were acting friendly, but Neil felt that something was wrong when they started recording the inventory of everything Neil's family possessed. The whole family was acting cautious around Comrade White and Alice, except for Yulia, who was obsessed with the ideology of communism and was desperately trying to befriend Alice. Unfortunately, soon they realized that their feelings of unease was right, and the most difficult time of their lives was about to begin. Within the next few days, the village church was completely destroyed. The priest and his wife were murdered, and Nil's uncle Ilya was killed by communist authorities for being a kulak, a term that used to mean just a wealthy farmer, but at the time it was applied to any farmer communist authorities wanted to eliminate. The late uncle's wife and daughter were forced to move out of their house, and all their belongings were taken away. The only thing that Neil managed to save was a wooden cradle that Uncle Ilya made for his baby daughter. Soon after that, one of the members of communist authorities moved into the vacated house. As time went on, the situation was getting more dire, and all the belongings of Neil's family were taken away as well, including their food and cattle. Very soon, people started starving and dying. I am not going to retell the whole storyline, not to spoil it for you, but I would like to stop on a few moments that grabbed my attention the most. The first shocking thing is the change of people's reaction on death. The number of famine victims was so huge that there were corpses lying around the streets. The first time Neil and his brother Slavko saw an unknown dead person near the road, they stopped to pay their respect to the deceased and pray. They were deeply affected by the first few deaths that they have seen, both their loved ones and the strangers. However, after some time, they got so used to the dead bodies that they didn't stop and pray anymore, but just stepped over them. It's important that the story depicts Holodomor not only as a physical genocide, but also as a cultural genocide. When communist authorities came to claim all the belongings from the house of late Uncle Ilya, they found a manuscript with Ukrainian folklore songs that Uncle Ilya and Aunt Polina were gathering for years, and they just burned them. Another way of denying people their culture was ruining the churches and forbidding religion and traditional holidays such as Christmas. Instead of those traditional holidays, the community had to celebrate new imposed holidays like New Year. The most tragic cultural barbarism was when communists ruined the village church and destroyed the icons, including an ancient icon of Saint Sophia with halos made of flecks of gold. Later, Neil found wood from that icon used in horse stables. When you read about all those horrible tragedies and deaths, you probably think about how the world could ignore this genocide. The thing is, the situation was kept a secret. Foreign workers were bribed into keeping quiet about the situation, and foreign journalists were seeing stage shows instead of real life. There is an episode in the book where a market that is usually full of sick, starving people and huge lines to buy any food is transformed into a show for foreigners. For the time that foreign journalists were visiting the city, the market got cleared, all the starving people were taken out of the town. Actors were invited as merchants and dancers to entertain foreign audience. Even the bread loaves displayed at the counters were mostly wooden, and there is just enough real bread in case foreign guests wanted to purchase it. Impressed journalists went back to their countries and wrote about how prosperous and successful Soviet Union was. Very few worked hard to get to the truth. These are just a few topics that caught my attention, but there are still so many important topics covered in this book, such as the problem of betrayal, loss of one's family, second chances, holding on to one's humanity in the most challenging situations, and more. So I would recommend all of you to read this book, to know the whole story, especially as today you have a chance to purchase this book at our event. It's important to always keep the memory of the tragedy of Holodomor and share our history to keep it alive. And now I would like to invite Marsha to tell you more about her books.
Thank you very much, Sonia. That was wonderful. And I'm just going to grab a copy of it now because it's my other Holodomor book, and I just want to refer to it. So the reason that I wrote Winterkill, I didn't think that I would be ever writing a novel about the Holodomor. And the reason for that is because 23 years ago, when my first book about the Holodomor came out, I had hate mail, death threats that I endured for years. And that book was Enough, illustrated by Michael Marchenko. A picture book, like, why would people be so upset that, they would try and make my life heck. But after I'd had a number of World War II novels published by Scholastic, and particularly Scholastic in the US, which is a different entity than Scholastic in Canada, they're separate, and the books were doing really well, we were out for dinner. My husband, Boris, put up your hand. This is my husband. and editors from Scholastic New York. And one of the editors said to me, she said, what would you think about writing a novel for us set during the Holodomor? And I just about fell off my seat because I didn't think that, that's the biggest children's publisher in the world, would be interested in that topic. And the thing is that they have allowed me, and I'm saying that very specifically, allowed, to write on really gritty Ukrainian topics that no one else has been able to touch. And I'm grateful for that, but the reason that they let me do that is because people read my books. So it's good for them, and they see that I've carved a niche, but really, honestly, it's just because there are so few publishers who will publish Ukrainian stories that I fell into a niche. It's not that I carved it at all. I have been trying desperately to open up that niche for other people. There was another author here today, Olya Tachenko, and she has written, she's self-published, but she's written this absolutely most marvelous graphic novel that I want her to have professionally published. But the thing is that doors close for Ukrainian stories all the time. So when they said to me, we would like you to do this, I said, yes, I will do this. But okay, saying you're going to write a novel for young people that involves killing, 4 million, 10 million? We don't know how many because it was hidden, right? So how do you do that? How do you write a story like that without getting into death porn, corpse porn, right? Without getting into this thing where you have entertainment by killing people, which I will not do ever in my books. And I also, even though I didn't live through the Holodomor, I had no family members who lived through the Holodomor. So how do you approach this? And you have to have a personal connection. So I looked back at things that had happened in my family, and particularly after I started to do research for Winterkill. And my own grandfather, George Forchuk, was a card-carrying communist member in Canada. He came to Canada before the First World War. He was interned during World War I. That's what my first book, Silver Threads, was written about. When he got out of the internment camp, which he escaped, and went back to his homestead. It had been sold, but also his Ukrainian neighbors had divvied up all his livestock and possessions. And they said to him, well, you're a criminal because you were put in jail. So he felt that the Ukrainian community had turned their back on him, but also the Ukrainian church, had turned their backs on internees. And so the people who did open up soup kitchens were Communist Party. They had the community halls, right? And they served them soup. And so he found a community there. But the other thing is he had lost track of his mother and sister after the Russian Revolution, the Ukrainian Revolution, the end of World War I, like disaster, right? He hadn't been able to find them in Ukraine. And so when he found out that Stalin was inviting Americans and Canadians to come and help with collectivization, he signed up. He was not chosen because he wasn't a very good communist. He was a really good businessman. So he was turned down. But the thing is that that's my own grandfather, and he was buried as Comrade Forchuk. And so when I was writing Winterkill and when I was doing the research, I think that you have to come at every story with humility, that you have to not always say, them good, we bad, them, all this kind of stuff. You have to find the humanity in everybody and the mistakes in everybody, because if you expect other people to care about what happened to you, you've got to care about what happened to them as well. And so the other thing, this is a confession, when I voted for the first time, I voted for the Communist Party of Canada. It was me and the candidate. How stupid was I? But again, I'm admitting it. And so part of the inspiration for Winterkill, I always have a question for myself, and it's what would happen if. And the question was, what would happen if I was actually Alice in the book? And instead of being my grandfather's granddaughter, I was his daughter. And he did get accepted, and I went there with him to help Stalin collectivize Ukraine. But for the sake of a few generations and this and that, I could have done it. I could have been brainwashed enough to think that. And so that's where I started the story, was with Alice and what happened to her. And the way that I found out about Alice, she was a real person. She was from Toronto. And Rhea Kleiman, the brave journalist, Canadian journalist of Polish Jewish heritage, who told the truth when she went through the famine lands, she met a young girl in Kharkiv who came to her hotel room, knocked on the door, and her name was Alice, and she was from Toronto, and she and her father had come because of the call from Stalin to help with collectivization. There were probably more than hundreds, probably low thousands of North Americans who went there and collaborated with Stalin and helping with the deaths, right? But she was starving at this time. So there is a scene in Winterkill, and it's based on, the dialogue that's in there is from the article, the news article that Ray Kleiman wrote when she met Alice, and the effect that it had on her, being Canadian too, having this Canadian girl come to her door speaking English, and saying that she was starving on the streets, just, as well as the Ukrainians. But that was the reason that I wrote the book, was because basically Scholastic asked me to, but then I had to find that reason to get into it, and that's what it is. But enough is still, like, to me, this book just means so much, because this was actually the first commercial storybook to have been written on the Holodomor. So that was before all, like, countries had acknowledged that the Holodomor was a genocide. And that's why it got me into trouble. And so now, so many countries have recognized it, and that's good. But, I mean, the unfortunate truth is, the reason that they recognized it is because it's happening all over again in Ukraine. And it's just beyond comprehension, and I don't have to say this to you, but, you know, history is repeating itself in the worst way. And it's so hard for all of us. But my book was written before the war started, and it came out while the war was on. And so I was asked by a lot of schools and libraries to speak to teachers and also to kids, but about how do you talk about the war in Ukraine to kids, but also how did this happen? And so, you know, if you know history, then it does explain why things happen, why this prejudice builds up. But no one can really explain Putin, honestly. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, the very first World War II novel that I wrote for Scholastic was called Stolen Child when it was published, and then when the U.S. picked it up, it was republished as Stolen Girl, and it's recently been published in a Ukrainian edition. And I'm really grateful for this, and again, it's too timely, and I wished it wasn't, because it's about the stolen children. And it was when Hitler did it. And, you know, so who does Putin want to be? Is it Hitler or Stalin? You know, he wants to be both, doesn't he? He wants to be the super bad guy. But I mean, it's the book is being sold in Ukraine, and it's received very good response. And I think because it really hits home and people can see exactly what's happening. But the reason that I wrote this book in the first place, because I wasn't planning on writing another book set during World War II either. I had written one, and it also just wrapped up in this whole hate, death thing that I was getting. It was called Hope's War. I don't know if you remember it. It was published in 2001. And it was about a young girl in high school, just starting high school, and her beloved grandfather was falsely accused of being a Nazi war criminal. And so she had to live through the notoriety of this, but she also wanted to know what really happened. And so there are scenes in the past of her grandfather, Danilo, giving testimony, so past scenes of what really happened, and then her scenes of what's happening in her life. And so the seeds for all of my World War II novels are actually in Hope's War. Like if you read that now after reading my 6-book set during World War II, you'd go, oh, okay, I see. There is making bombs for Hitler. But I thought that was the end of it. But my mother-in-law, my late mother-in-law, she died when she was 80 of a brain tumor, but about 3 months before she died, she started to get, you know, loose lips, sink ships and all that. And if you have a fast-growing brain tumor, you'll say things that, you know, you're not as inhibited. And she had never talked about what she'd lived through in World War II. And she didn't talk about it to her kids, my husband and brother-in-law. But she called me up this one day and she said, Marsha, she says, I'm kind of annoyed with you. This was not my mother-in-law. Like, she was so polite, but we didn't know what was going on with her. And she says, you said that you always write about young children in time of war or time of distress. You never wrote about me. And I said, you never told me? And she said, well, true, but come over now and I'm going to make you a cup of coffee and I'm going to tell you everything. And sorry, Oris, but she had really bad coffee. But I went anyway. I went. And she said, bring a steno pad and like more than one pen. And so I did, and she just told me everything. And the thing that she felt guilty about was being a survivor. She lost half of her classmates to the Lebensborn program. And she asked me to write about that. Now, I didn't write about it the way that it happened to her, because there are things that you have to do to maintain the dignity of victims. And it's the same thing in Winterkill. There's no scenes of cannibalism, because honestly, I think that the emphasis on that is can really be used by Russian propagandists to dehumanize Ukrainians. So in Winterkill, there is a scene, and it's someone with a big pot, and it's an homage to everybody who thought I was going to do the usual. But then what it is it's a belt that's being stewed, because I will not go there. And the same thing in Stolen Child, Stolen Girl. My mother-in-law's classmates were older, and so what the girls were taken for, and there are young people here, so I'm going to mince words. So it was older women older girls who were taken, who were assaulted until they got pregnant, and then once the baby was born, then they were killed. I could not write about that in a children's book. So what I wrote about was the other part of the Lebensborn program, where they took really young children who were young enough to be brainwashed into thinking that they were German. Now, their fates would have been ultimately the same, because they were tattooed here so that they could never mix with true Aryans. But they had a longer time, and my book ended before any of that happened. But I wrote this because my mother-in-law made me. And there's a scene in here. And my mother-in-law loved soup. Isn't that a Ukrainian thing? Like, does any Ukrainian not like soup? And so she would do this thing. Just before, like, we'd sit down for a meal, she'd take a spoonful of soup. She'd say, "That's really good soup." She says, "But it's not as good as what I had when we were escaping." And so I just want to read you this short scene, and then Sonia is going to read the same one in Ukrainian for you. But this is my mother-in-law. Marusia and so she escaped with her mother and father. And it was a scene that happened to my mother-in-law. Marusia and I are sprawled on an open flat car in the blackest part of night. Other escapees too, all holding on as the train chugs along at an alarming speed. It slows to a stop. I sit up. I watch in horror as Marusia jumps off and runs into a farmer's field. She's scrabbling in the dry earth, digging with her bare hands. I hear her hoot for joy. She runs back and jumps into the flat car. "Potatoes," she said, "2 of them." One of the other fugitives brings a pot out of a tattered bag, and someone makes a small fire from gathered twigs in the middle of the flat car. Another man who has run into the field comes back with his hat filled with muddy water. He dumps it into the pot. Marusia adds the potatoes. The steam of cooking potatoes makes my stomach grumble. I've had nothing to eat for days. This is the first time the train has stopped since we had taken refuge on the flat car. The potatoes are barely cooked, but we cannot wait. We have no idea how long the train will remain still, and we're afraid that the smell of fire will bring soldiers. One man has a spoon tucked away in his frayed coat. He takes it out reverently and dips into our soup and gives me, the only child, the first spoonful. It's the best soup I've ever tasted. The spoon is passed around like a sacrament. Within minutes, every drop is consumed and the train starts moving just as we're finishing. Sonia.
So I'm going to read the same part in Ukrainian. Найчорніша частина ночі. Ми з Марусею розкинулися на відкритому вагоні-платформі. Усі решта біженців теж учепилися в платформу. Потяг мчить на загрозливій швидкості. Тоді сповільнюється до зупинки. Я сиджу і з жахом дивлюся, як Маруся зістрибує і біжить на фермерське поле. Вона риє суху землю, розкопує голими руками. Я чую, як вона скрикує від радості. Біжить назад і стрибає на платформу. «Картопля», каже вона. 2. Хтось витягує з потертого мішка горщик, а хтось розпалює вогонь із зібраних прямо посеред платформи гілочок. Ще один чоловік побіг на поле і повертається з капелюхом, наповненим каламутною водою. Вона зливає її в горщик. Маруся додає картоплю. Від пари вареної картоплі мій шлунок починає бурчати. Я вже кілька днів нічого не їла. Це вперше поїзд зупинився відтоді, як ми прихистилися на платформі. Картопля ледь зварилася, та ми не можемо чекати. Ми гадки не маємо, як довго поїзд стоятиме на місці. Боїмося, що запах вогню приверне увагу солдатів. В одного чоловіка в потертому пальті схована ложка. Він шанобливо дістає її, занурює в наш суп і дає мені, єдиній дитині, першу ложку. Це найкращий суп, який я коли-небудь куштувала. Ми передаємо ложку, як на причасті. За кілька хвилин не залишається ані краплі. Щойно ми закінчили, поїзд рушає.
Маринка, візьми налийши її води. Пані Марші, візьми шклянку.
So,
Мені також.
that's it for me. If you have questions, I'd love to answer.
That's fine.
Yes, Stacy.
Marsha, who did the translation?
Yulia Lupka did the translation. And this is what I've heard, and you know, I don't speak Ukrainian, and it's one of my biggest regrets, and I'm dyslexic, and it's hard for me to learn other languages, and I did take Ukrainian. So I gave it to a friend who is an academic to read, and he said, this is brilliant. And Making Bombs for Hitler has just been translated, so it will be coming out shortly. And my academic friend read it, and he says, really good.
Great.
Yes.
So what inspired you to write your first book?
So what inspired me to write my first book was I have so many rooms in my head with stories that if I didn't write them down, honestly, I think my head might explode. But you know, the other thing too is that, you know, we've all had difficult things happen in our lives, right? We've had things that we could use those things to identify who we are, but I don't like to do that. I like to take the experiences that I had as a young person, and I like to think of how fortunate I am, but then look at other people and think, what have they gone through? And so oftentimes you can pass someone in the street and you can think that they, you know, I wish I was them, because look at those sparkly pants. Or something like that, right? But then when you find out who they really are, you're able to step inside of them. And so I just have a passion for stepping inside of people and stories that I had no idea about. And often they say that what you should write is write what you know. Well, no. What's the fun in that? You have to, for me, you have to write about what you want to know about. And that, you know, it may be hard work, but like come as a blank slate and find out. Yes, Pinka.
So when you go through the writing process, and I mean, we saw you do get emotional because these are very, very emotional topics. How do you get through that to write?
I weep. I'm sitting there weeping. But the thing is that if I wasn't, then it wouldn't be on the page either. And so it's one reason that I've never I'm in the midst of writing a trilogy right now, and I've actually agreed to a trilogy. But up until that point, I've always said I'm writing a book, and then the publisher is the one that comes back and says, well, what about book 2? What about book 3? And I think, but I could only do it one book at a time because I kept on thinking, okay, now I'm going to take a break. But I haven't taken a break for 25 years. But like I can only write thinking that I will ultimately get a break. And so it's tricking myself into that. But really, I can't write about purple dinosaurs. It's not in me. I have to write about what's happened, like experiences of people, because especially silenced people. So I didn't write all these Ukrainian books on purpose. It's that they were stories that needed to be told. Because I've also written six books of World War I Armenian history, and I'm not Armenian. I've written 4 about Vietnamese refugees, and I'm not Vietnamese. The reason that I did it was because no one was doing what I could do, which was write from a young person's point of view and write it fictionally. So these are stories that we need to know. Yes?
Is that called a historical fiction?
Yes, so there's actually 2 different genres that I write. I'm not counting picture books because I haven't done a picture book for a while. But I write narrative nonfiction and historical fiction. And so if, like for example, with the Vietnamese refugees, I was able to meet them face to face. And so when I wrote the stories, I could vet every single piece of dialogue that I put into their mouth with everybody that was in my book. Like, you know, because it was an entire family, right? And they'd come back with little tweaks. But also because they had suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, it's not like they're telling me the story. I still have to research it as much as when you're researching historical fiction. Mm-hmm. So you have to do the research all different ways and then create this, craft this. But the difference is that the dialogue is exactly those people, so you can use those exact names. With historical fiction, I will choose that format if a significant number of the people in the story that I want to tell have died. Because I cannot use the first and last name of a real person who has died that I can't say, can I put these words in your mouth? Or even if I have a direct quote somewhere, I don't have the moral authority to use that because I could be taking it out of context, and we've all seen that, haven't we? So that's when I write historical fiction. But again, every single thing that I use in the book happened. One reason that I write for young people and not adults is because a lot of adult, what's called historical fiction, I would call historical fantasy, because they didn't do any research. So they might read a novel to research a novel, which I think is deplorable. But I go back to the primary sources and I write it. And so in Winterkill, if you read Winterkill, you'll see Anne Applebaum all the way through, because I didn't reference her book, but you'll see that her chronology and her examples helped me. It's not the only one I used. I used 50, 60 books, right? But I didn't make anything up. You don't have to make anything up about the Holodomor. Why would you? And especially with something like the Holodomor, because so many people say it's not true. So all the more reason to make sure that absolutely everything that you have is not fiction. It happened. And you also have to moderate to the less sensational for that very reason, because the things that are even less sensational are so horrific that just, you know, do that.
I have a question. If yes. Anybody has a question?
Yeah, so you write for young people. And from my experience, I can say that young people usually read for leisure or just to relax. And your books are not like easy to read at all. They are pretty tragic. But still you have lots of young readers, and you have people who come back to read many of your books. So why do you think they keep reading your books and keep coming back?
So that's a really interesting question, and I don't know if everybody heard it. So the question was that in Sonia's experience, young people read just for pleasure. But I'm writing really serious topics, but my books are popular. How come? Is that basically, yeah. Yes? So I didn't read until I was 9. And so I have no patience for slow books or books that aren't visual or books that have too many adjectives in it. So I basically write books for myself. And I think that a lot of young people really like that because it's the same thing. Like, they're not bored to tears. Like, I think that young people are very savvy readers. And young people will read one paragraph of a book and say, I'm not reading anymore. Am I right? Yeah. So you have to write for young people. What it means, if you're going to be a popular writer for young people, you have to have more skill than for adults. I'm sorry, but adults will give it, I bet you, who here will give a book 100 pages? Put up your hand before you put it down. So you see? but like mostly not kids. But like, you know, so you have to grab at the beginning and you have to keep on going. The other thing about young people is they're very interested in history and they're very interested in war. And so it just turns out that what I write seems to meld with what young people want to buy. And my books, where they sell the most, it's not in stores so much, it's in scholastic book fairs, you know, so the pop-up fairs. And in the States in particular, you know, they've got middle grade schools where there's 2,000 kids all in grade 5 and 6, right? So they do a scholastic book fair in one of those, and my books just like fly out the door. And because they're telling each other, this is a good one. And this is wonderful for Ukrainian history, because what it means is those books that they're reading as pleasure, and they're reading because they find it exciting, they are learning about Ukrainian history subliminally. And the teachers also know that they can get their kids to read those books, and then they can do lesson plans on them. I have like mixed reactions to that, because like I don't want people to think it's homework, but on the other hand, if they do one that way and then they read all the others. But kids are really discerning readers, and like the emails that I get and the snail mails that I get from kids, it would just blow your socks off. These are smart people, and this is our future, and I'm really happy about that, because it makes me optimistic in the face of like a lot of stuff that's going on. But kids are really smart.
So my question is actually a follow-up to Sonia's question, since you know, what was the most touching or inspiring review you got from a young reader?
What was the most touching or inspiring review that I got from a young reader? So I actually just got one about a week ago, or a couple weeks ago, and it was just around when we did our interviews, a few days before that, and he was in high school, and he actually was driving, and he just said that reading Making Bombs for Hitler made him appreciate his sister more. Because, you know, it's about siblings being split apart, right? And he's just talking about how it really helped with his relationship with family members. But there's another one that I got, and this would have been in 2014 or something like that, because it's when Making Bombs for Hitler won the Silver Birch Award in Ontario. And a kid came up to me, and he had written a blog post, and I had read this blog post, and I thought, that's got to be an adult who wrote that, pretending to be a kid. And then this kid came up to me and he said, I wrote that because like I'd written what a wonderful piece that you've written. And so he introduced himself to me. And what he said in this, he said that after reading Making Bombs for Hitler and realizing how little Lida had to eat every day, he would never complain about what he was served for supper. He said also he stopped picking on his little sister. Wow. But like, and in this, he was really young. He was maybe 10 years old, and it had a profound effect on him. And it was just the goodness that Lida had, and the example that she had. And you know, like to me, that's the greatest compliment. But he also said that it was the first book that he read on purpose and enjoyed, and it made him into a reader.
Amazing.
So this has nothing to do with Ukrainian. It has everything to do with empathy, you know, just appreciation of life.
Just goodness.
But in the meantime, he's finding out about Ukrainian history, which if you don't know, then you can't understand world history. And so that's the other reason that I write about Ukrainian history, is because it really is central. And I think, was it you that asked me what's my favorite country in Europe? And I said Ukraine, because to me it's the center of Europe. It is, because like history, everything, you know, is so central in Ukraine. Swirls around what happens in Ukraine. Questions? Yes.
I was wondering if you could share some insights into that discussion with your mother-in-law, not only because, but we come from a family that's a bit similar in that my husband's Gigi had also fled and didn't share anything, didn't share the language either, and didn't want wanted a different kind of life and wanted to see everyone be like a professional, if you will.
Right.
So even though he had like a plumbing and carpentry sort of background, he wanted something different. I just wondered, you know, because obviously she kept a lot inside and probably didn't have anyone to really share these things with. So what was that like when she could sit down with you and tell you everything?
So with your situation with your dad, it's a coping strategy, because it's like a wound being opened, and then, you know, you put the scar tissue on top, and the scar tissue is not healthy, like, you know, it's not the original skin, but it covers up some of the hurt. And so going there, and like, for someone who has endured what your father has endured, it's your father and your mother, or?
No, my husband's father's father.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Your relative. I'm
Yeah.
going to stick with that.
They're Gigi's.
Yes. Okay. And so opening it up and talking about it is as painful as living through it again. So this is why they don't want to do it. And what was happening with my in-laws, and it was both my father-in-law and mother-in-law who were refugees, you know, they lived through Stalin and Hitler, right? And so they wouldn't tell their kids about it. And then they would try and go back home, and they would have nightmares, and then they'd cancel the trip. So one of the things that helped them open up a little bit and actually visit Ukraine again was when my mother, who was of Irish descent, and I went to Ukraine, and then they booked the identical trip, and they actually took it, and it was sort of like just that little baby step into the past made them realize that they could do it. So finding something that can open a little, is he still alive?
No, unfortunately.
That makes it really hard.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I do with people who are alive, and I'm trying to interview them about something that is like that wound underneath a barely healed scar, is I'll ask them first about something that is not threatening. So oftentimes I'll say, can you tell me about the first day of school? What, you know, and not about the first day, but what did you wear? Or what about your shoes? Like something that they can focus on that's not threatening, and then go into, what did you take for lunch? And then you find out, well, lunch, what are you talking about? But do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So this gradual thing, and then, so once you've talked about something that's non-threatening, then you can get into things that are more difficult to talk about, but you've eased into it. And so I interview a lot of people for my books, and this technique works. The other thing is that never would I bring a tape recorder in, any kind of taping device, recording device, and for many I would never take a pencil, like pen and paper even. And so this is the gift of dyslexia, actually, is because like I remember things in images like a movie in my head. I just go back into the car and write furiously. And then I'd call and make sure that I got things right, because like numbers are no good for me. Numbers are no good. I mean, what's the story about 6 and 9? I really don't understand. But anyways, being non-threatening so that you're listening but you're not judging will help a lot. But in your situation, like I'm wondering whether you can do some genealogy studies and whether you can meet people whose family has gone through the same thing and see whether there are journals or diaries that have been written of that era to get insight.
We find that your books actually do that for us. So thank you.
That's great.
Very much
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah. Thank you.
And
I
they
really
end,
appreciate that.
for the most part, positively. You know, people,
For the most part.
they survive, and they
Yes.
they whether they stay in Europe or emigrate, either way, they live and thrive. So,
But you can, there are like diaries, and you can get them in used bookstores, you can get them in various places, like self-published diaries of an era. You can find, and they're a really good source of like obscure historical events that are very significant to your family, but maybe not a lot of other people. And I highly recommend that. And email me, like contact me, okay? I'm really easy to contact. Just Google my last name and my website comes up and there's a contact form. And I can help you with that if you want, okay?
Thank you so much.
There's a question right in the back. Hello.
Oh, yeah.
Can you be a second Winterkill?
So here's the thing. I was supposed to write a second to Winterkill, and you can tell because the characters are kind of poised for it. And I really wanted to get into Yulia's head because I was annoyed with her, and she needed her comeuppance. But then when the war started, I couldn't go there because the next book would have been set during the terror years, the Stalin terror years. So it's bad enough that my characters had to live through the Holodomor and die through the Holodomor. But then they were going to live through this horrible time that Stalin put them through. But it would have been the final chunk in all of my books because then I would have covered so many aspects from the Holodomor to the end of World War II. I probably will write it at some point. But when the war started, I set it aside. I just couldn't do it. And I started writing a book set in the 1500s about Roxolana. And then Scholastic came back to me and they said, we need you to write books about what's happening in the war now. And I turned them down. And then they came back and they asked again and I turned them down. And then they came back with 3 managers. And they said, we need this, and you've already wasted a year. And so we want a trilogy, and what are they going to be? So I got to pick it, and this is Scholastic US, which is the biggest children's publisher in the world. So the first one is already written. So what it means is the sequel to Winterkill will be later. Because the first one is written and it's coming out in November, and it's set in Mariupol. Starts on the day of the war, that the war starts, and it's about a girl named Daria who is captured and taken into Russia. It's one of the captured children. And then the next book, it's her sister, and she and her father are in Azovstal together, and of course she's a civilian, so her story is different, but she is able to hear what's happening through her father. And the third one, I'm hoping, will be When We Win. So yes. I gave them a baloney outline for that one. They don't know it's a baloney outline, but this is what I'm hoping. So, but then I want to write Roxolana, and then I'll probably go back to Winterkill, and maybe I'll be able to do it because by that time Putin will be dead, and I'll have the heart to write it. I'll actually have the passion to write it.
How did you feel when you released your first book?
It was really exciting, but it was also weird because, I thought if you had a book out, everybody would know who you were. It doesn't happen. But then, that's kind of a nice thing because, you can go places and nobody knows who you are, and so you're like, okay, I like this. But I didn't realize that the only people who know about a book are maybe people you're related to, and that's it. Because a book and the author are separate things, right? People say, you wrote that book? Yeah, all right. And I've had to prove it sometimes. So I was at a school one time, and it was with Silver Threats. It was my very first book. And that book had also been printed in a school anthology that was used in all the schools. And so I had just done a presentation, and this kid came up, and he looked really annoyed. And he says, you didn't really write that book. And I said, what are you talking about? He says, we've already read it, and I know that you didn't write it, and you stole it from this anthology. And I says, can you show me? And so he goes and gets this thing, and he opens it up, and he says, and I says, look, that's my picture in there. He says, that doesn't look like you. It was true. But, so, there's no glory to writing books, I gotta say. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, today you said that Alice is a real person.
Yes.
And why did you want to take her story for your book?
So I wanted to take her story. I changed her last name because I wasn't able to interview her. But I wanted to have her in because of all the characters in Winterkill, Alice is me. because she was propagandized into thinking that communism was a good thing, and that she had to change her entire life view when she realized what she was doing was killing people. And so I had to change my life view from, I was a very idealistic young person, and I thought that communism was a good thing, and I did the same thing. But I also feel that she's a symbol of how we feel about things, because right now there's so much polarization in our world. And people just kind of they're like a stick in the mud, and they won't listen to other people. And I think that you always have to be open to be wrong. And if you can't acknowledge that you could be wrong, then don't expect other people to feel any differently, because you have to start somewhere. The other thing, I think that one of the most powerful sentences is, I'm sorry, and I'm wrong. And my husband will say, I don't say that enough. That's because I'm always right. But I mean, those things are really important. The humility to know when you're wrong. And so I felt that when I was writing the book that I was Alice. Now, the thing is when I did the first draft, I had alternating chapters, one of Alice, one of Neil, back and forth through the whole thing, because my previous book was Traitors Among Us, and I'd just done that, and I really liked that technique of having the opposing narratives. And then my editor, and it wasn't my first editor, it goes through 3 big editors and then there's little editors. So this is the second big editor. And she says, I really don't like Alice. She's cold. And I thought, oh, but she's mean. And she said all these things that she had, because she's got such a horrible attitude, she says no one's going to like her because of the things that she does. And that was kind of the point. But she said she's just so off-putting. She says it would be better to have those scenes from Neil's point of view. So, and I says, okay, because an editor's always right. And I said, so how much time do I have to make these changes? And she's talking about rewriting half of a novel. And she says, how about a month? I said, okay. And so my usual writing schedule is a 3-hour writing stint in a day. And so I did 3 3-hour writing stints, and I got it done in a month. And the thing is that she was right. So again, it's you have to have the humility to know when you're wrong. So I thought that was interesting, that I had her as a character to show that, and then I had to change her around to show that.
And have you had the same story, maybe another example about Holodomor?
So, you mean another person that I actually...
Yeah.
So, when I was writing Enough, so I just want to tell you a little bit about this book. It's about a girl and her father, and they hide the grain in graves to make Stalin think that everybody's dead, because there's a mass grave. So it's for young kids. But this is also actually based on something that really happened, because people during the Holodomor, they did not bury grain in graves, but what they did do is they went to the graveyards and they took gold rings off their own ancestors' hands, and sometimes could buy a crust of bread. And so I felt that symbolically, that was a tribute to the people who had to do that. And so always in my books, every single person is inspired by a real person. But sometimes they're composites. In most cases, they're composites. So I'll take a little bit from here, a little bit from there, a little bit from there, and create a person who can represent that experience. That's what writing is, right? That's what creative writing is. Maybe one more question, if there is one more question.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not a question. I'd just like to tell you that we have a book club, and the ages are from 60 to 88.
What? That's awesome.
Yes, and we are going to enjoy this phenomenally.
Oh,
Thank you,
great.
thank you.
Thank you.
That's great. Okay.
Thanks so
bravo.
much. And Kontakt Ukr is here with books.
Yes.
So, support your local Ukrainian bookstore.
Thank you very much, Pani Marsha, for this wonderful talk, and Sonia for a wonderful introduction. Thank you very much to everyone for coming. And we are not finishing our event yet. As Pani Marsha said, there are books here. You can get an autograph. You can still ask questions, mingle. Please enjoy. And I wanted to thank you, our sponsors. It's Delta Bingo and Kontakt Ukrainian TV program.